Hello guys, welcome to Mel's Life, where we dive into everything life has to offer and we try to solve some of its problems. Okay guys, so today is the second day of our September book club, and as you all know, we are doing the Twisted series, and last week we started with Twisted Love, which is the first book in this series of 4 books. Now, these books can be read as standalones, but it's better to read them as a series because the characters in the books reoccur throughout all 4 of the books. So last week we covered Twisted Love, and the second one is called Twisted Games, where we dive into Princess Bridgette a bit more. If you can recall, she is one of the characters in the first book, one of our main characters' best friends in that book. This time she is going to be our main character, but before we get into too much detail, let's take a look at who the characters will be in this story. Okay, so as always, before we get into the actual review of the story, I thought we would just look at some of the characters in this story, so you at least know kind of who we are talking about, who's doing what, and all that jazz. And also, as you can see, kind of the recurring characters, because of course Twisted Games is book number 2 in the Twisted series, and although they can be read as a standalone, it is kind of a series with some of the characters from the first book, Twisted Love, that we covered last week, also appearing in this one. So I'm not going to start with the main characters, and you'll see why. I'm just going to start kind of going and then I'll explain. So King Edward is the king of Eldora, and he is grandfather to Princess Bridgette and Prince Nikolai. Now, Princess Bridgette is our main female character in this story. Her brother, of course, is Prince Nikolai, who is a bit older than her, which is why he is the next in line for the throne after his grandfather, King Edward. Now, they were raised by their grandfather because their parents died when they were very young, so that is why their parents aren't included here, but their grandfather is kind of the guy who raised them. He's also the king, and of course in the beginning of the story, Prince Nikolai is working his way to becoming king after his grandfather. Then we of course have Bridgette's best friends, who you may recognize. We have Jules, who is a law student. We have Stella, who is an influencer, and we have Ava, our main character from Twisted Love, who is a photographer. They are Princess Bridgette's best friends in this story. Then of course we remember Ava's brother Josh, who I will include in here because he does, I think, make an appearance. Then we have Ava's boyfriend now, Alex, also from the first book. And then Princess Bridgette, being a princess, needs bodyguards. So her first bodyguard is Booth, and this we start the story with Booth. But he is obviously going to leave, and she needs to get a new bodyguard, who is our male lead character in the story, and his name is Rice Larson. He is the second bodyguard she gets when Booth leaves, and he is also our male lead character. And Rice's boss is Christian. He is employing Rice. Rice, of course, is an ex-Navy SEAL who is now working in security for Christian, who owns a security company. And that is basically the characters that we have in the story. There are some other minor characters that I didn't include here because even though they play a part in the story, these are kind of the characters that you need to know about to kind of follow the story along. So that is the characters that I included here in this little presentation for you. At least now you know who the people in the story is. So now we can kind of go ahead and look at the story itself. Okay, so now that we know who the characters are, let's get into the actual story. So before we get started, this book is divided into part 1 and part 2 because there is a significant time jump. So part 1 starts where about a month before the climactic event of Twisted Love, the first book, and then after that there is about a time jump of 3 to 4 months where Bridgette graduates. Then there's about a time jump of 1 to 2 years. Then we see a couple of things happen, and part 1 ends. From part 1 to part 2, there's another time jump of about 2 years, and then we see the rest of the story develop from there. So one of the main concerns for a lot of people was the time jumps. It made it difficult to kind of keep track of where the story is going. Also, it makes you feel like you're going to miss out on some of the relationship building, because once again it feels like the relationship just develops too fast, even though it doesn't, because they do mention the time that passes. But yeah, still the time jumps were something that a lot of people were concerned with. So of course our story kind of follows the normal structure of a story. You have your beginning, you have the build up, you have your climactic event, and you have a resolution. I think the reason why this was kind of divided into two parts is because there are a lot of big things that happen, and I think to choose which one is the climactic moment, they had to divide into two, because in both parts there are big things that happen. So in the beginning, Rice is introduced to Bridgette, and the relationship starts building from there. We start learning more about both the characters and their backgrounds. Rice is, of course, an ex-Navy SEAL. Bridgette is, of course, a princess whose brother, Prince Nikolai, is in line for the throne of Eldora. We learn a lot about Bridgette and her love for animals, and of course, she has a bit of a tragic past with both her parents passing away. Rice has a tragic past as well, but we don't learn much about that in the beginning. We learn more about his past in part 2 of the story. So there's a decent amount of character building, there's a decent amount of background story, again with the tragic background, which a lot of authors go for. I get it, I understand it. But yeah, it's quite common for the characters to have a tragic background, which I get, I understand. But yeah, that's what it is. So there's a lot of background information, and by the end of the book there's obviously a lot of growth, a lot of character development. They deal with a lot of the tragedies, they deal with a lot of the guilt that they still feel about certain things. So decent character development, I would say. More so on the part of Rice, because I think he has a lot more to deal with, but there is definitely some character development for Bridgette as well, because she has to go from Princess Bridgette, who never in her life wants to be queen and is gladly not going to be because of her brother who is older. And spoiler alert, it just so happens in the book that events lead to the fact that she is going to become queen, and we kind of get to see how she deals with that, how she deals with going from I never want to be queen to can I be a good queen to I am going to be a good queen. So that is a lot of development there as well, which is really nice to see from, you know, because you can just imagine having to go through something so life-changing, and how you would deal with that. And then, of course, there's the aspect of when you do become queen, the noble, you have to marry someone of royal descent or something, and that, of course, puts her and Rice's relationship to the test, which is also really fun to read, because there is a lot of challenges. And the reason I really like this is because with Twisted Love, the first book, the conflict came from the characters themselves, with Alex and Ava. Whereas with this one, the characters, there was conflict between the two of them at the start, but that's before any sort of relationship, romantic relationship started to build. By the end, the conflict is more so from outside than between the two. There's never really a betrayal of trust or anything like that. It is definitely more so outside parties that influence their relationship, which is kind of nice to see, because usually in these types of stories, one of the two characters does something severely wrong, and it's very hard to then build up the trust again. Whereas in this one, it's definitely outside factors influencing their relationship, and that eventually drive them apart for a bit, but neither of them ever really thinks the other doesn't love them. So that is kind of a different thing to see in the story, which I really kind of do like. So I kind of gave one of the spoilers that Bridgette finds out she's going to be queen, which I would say is going to be the climactic event of part 1. Part 2, it's, I read the book quite a while ago, so I'm not sure which parts exactly fall into part 2, but there are quite a lot of things that happen in part 2 where Bridget is now preparing to be queen, and then it happens a lot quicker than she thinks. Obviously, having the trouble with her relationship with Rice, a lot of the conflict surrounding that, I would say, leads up to the big climactic moments in part 2. But in the end, of course, love conquers all, and they find a way that to keep Bridget in her queenly position, as well as uh, keeping their relationship alive. And then you have your resolution and kind of a hint at the end of the third, and even the final book. There's a little bit of a hint in the final moments of Twisted Games, uh, and yes, that is kind of where it ends without giving away too much. So some of my thoughts: the time jumps are a little confusing. It does kind of make it difficult to place yourself within the story. Also, with the time jumps, there is a lot of the relationship building that you don't see. But then again, of course, 2 years worth of relationship building is difficult to fit into one book. So I understand why the time jumps, but a lot of the people did have problems with the time jumps, and I can understand why. But I don't think it's too hard to kind of figure out where you're at with these time jumps. It's not too bad. It's more so when you're getting to the third book that you kind of just now need to reorientate yourself and figure out where you're at. I do like the relationship building between these two because it takes them forever to just kind of put their things aside, because there's a lot of first of all, at first they don't get along because he is very serious and protective and she thinks he's overbearing. There's a lot of conflict there at the beginning, but eventually, they start growing closer. But then it's kind of the professional boundaries that come into play. So there's a lot of aspects to their relationship that I really like. As I mentioned, the fact that most of the conflict after they kind of get over themselves comes from outside parties, which is a different story. So I really like that part. There's definitely a lot of character building. I would say for Rice more so than Bridget, although there are a lot of things that she also has to overcome. So don't take it that she doesn't develop as a character. She definitely does. But there's a lot of things Rice has to kind of deal with to eventually decide that he's willing to fight for this relationship. So I really do enjoy the character development that takes place in this book. It's really nice to see. The tragic backstories, as always, it builds the characters. I get it. So it is a good part of the story. Yeah, I don't have much bad things to say about the story. Again, I think it comes down to personal preference. There are some of the things that I don't like, but that just depends on the author and the writing styles that you kind of like. So there's a couple of things I don't like about that, but that's just like very small things that are, I think, very personal to me. So I don't want to judge the book based on that. I want to kind of give an overview that is kind of objective, as well as objective as I can get with it. All in all, I think it's a really good story. Twisted Games is definitely one of my favorites of the series, so definitely worth the read. If you don't want to read the whole series, I would definitely recommend you read this one, because it's definitely a fun and exciting story, and you also get a little bit of insight into the royals of Eldora. It's kind of a different storyline there, so you kind of get to see, like, because most of these, all three of the other books take place in the States, with exception to a part of Twisted Love taking place in London. This one takes place in the States, and then of course in Eldora, so you kind of get to learn a bit more about another country as well. So all in all, I think this book is definitely worth the read. I would definitely recommend it. Like I said, some of the writing style in this book I don't personally like that much, but it's not enough for me to say do not read it. It's very small parts of the books, this book, of the writing style that personally I don't really like, but that's a personal thing, and you might not have that problem. So again, for the third and the final time, Really good book. Would definitely recommend that you put this on your to be read list if it's not too long already. Next week we will be covering the third book in the series, but hopefully I will be seeing you guys for another video pretty soon. Bye.